Welcome to the BrainBox podcast. BrainBox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings the scholarship of the humanities disciplines to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. BrainBox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our on-air guests to make the humanities relevant to today and challenge listeners to use their BrainBox to make better sense of current events. We'll talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics, who will give informed views on history and culture. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the website, and you can also email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. In this episode, we'll be talking about alternative Oklahoma history with Dr. Rachel C. Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and she completed her Ph.D. in the Composition, Rhetoric, and Literacy program at the University of Oklahoma in 2016. She currently holds a diversity postdoctoral fellow position in the Rhetoric and Writing Studies program at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Jackson's research examines local activist rhetorical strategies in the context of historical suppression. Her community-engaged projects focus on supporting Native American languages and cultural literacies, and forwarding indigenous perspectives, voices, and stories. She works with tribal elders, leaders, and community members across Oklahoma to develop and implement classes, workshops, and digital humanities projects. Her work has appeared in College Composition and Communication, College English, and Rhetoric Review. She's a Ford Foundation Fellow and a Fellow with the Newberry Consortium on American Indian Studies. Dr. Jackson received the 2017 Berlin Award and the 2017 Omen Award from the National Council of Teachers of English. We're really honored to have you here. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, my copy of the book Alternative Oklahoma, which is edited by Davis Joyce, describes this concept of alternative Oklahoma as an honest alternative exploration of the state's diverse past. It's an Oklahoma history that takes into account the overlooked and the left behind, and it contributes to a more open political dialogue. And you taught a class on this subject at OU, right?
Yes, I did. I taught an expository writing course on the alternative Oklahoma theme.
Cool. I definitely want to talk to you more about that later on. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about, you've written an article in our fall 2018 Oklahoma Humanities magazine about the first state flag of Oklahoma, which has a red field with a white star in the center and the number 46 in it. And you wrote about running across a brief reference to this first flag and how it became a symbol of everything you didn't know but wanted to find out about the state's political landscape and history. Mm-hmm. So what does the story of the red flag tell us about the early history of Oklahoma?
Well, I think the story of the red flag tells us that our political history is perhaps richer than we imagine it today. And I think that can be said about history in general. To make history a living thing, a living entity in our lives means to imagine it as a rich, expansive field of knowing. So the red flag came into my life at a time where I was trying to figure out my own place as a person with political opinions outside the norm in Oklahoma. And that, of course, led me to question those norms. Because I grew up here, and I lived here my whole life, and I felt like my political views were informed by my experience as a Oklahoman.
Did you grow up in Oklahoma City?
I did. I grew up in Oklahoma City. I'm a graduate of the old John Marshall High School.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. And I went to UCO for my bachelor's, and I went to University of Tulsa for my master's, and OU for my PhD, and now I'm at Oklahoma State.
Where next?
So, yes, and I was educated here. So it became very curious to me. The flag helped me to better articulate my questions about Oklahoma. What does our sort of normative, stereotypical conception of Oklahoma as a red state limit us from seeing? Right? How does it become a filter that blocks out counter narratives, counter stories, counter histories that would better inform our understanding of this place and of ourselves? my question became, as I studied the red flag, first of all, why don't we know about this? Why have I lived here my whole life and I didn't know there was a flag before the current flag?
It was never taught to you in an Oklahoma history
Never seen
course.
It in my life until I was like 28 years old.
Oh.
Yeah. And I was reading a book about, it's Jim Bissett's book, Agrarian Socialism, I believe the title is, and then Marx, Jefferson, and Jesus Christ in the Oklahoma countryside.
Great title.
Great title. Fabulous title. And that's where I saw the reference to the flag. And I just started tracing it down and tracking it down, and over the course of really a decade or more now. And it led unto these other paths, of inquiry that eventually amounted to my dissertation, where I talk about all these different counter narratives around Oklahoma that sort of resist that dominant way of constructing our sense of place. But to just give you the facts, the red flag was designed by a woman named Ruth Clement. She was the wife of a prominent man in the Stillwater area. And it was adopted almost as an afterthought. Because we became a state in 1907, the flag wasn't adopted till 1911. And it was Ruth Clement that brought the proposal to adopt it to the state legislature. And she found someone to represent it on the floor, and it was adopted almost as, like I said, an afterthought. It received very little attention. But how she was selling it was basically that Oklahoma would be the 46th star on the American flag. And this had been sort of a rallying cry around statehood. The 46th star, right? And so she made that the emblem of the state flag. And, women from all around the state got together and made these flags to fly all over the state once they were adopted. And it was only about 8 years later, in 1919, that the flag actually, by that time, had become very unpopular because it was a red flag. And in 1919, in the context of Bolshevism and the labor movement, which also used red flags, the flag had become unpopular.
Why did she choose red in the first place?
Well, it's curious, isn't it? And of course, it became the statute on the books is still on the books. It makes it a felony to fly a red flag in the state of Oklahoma. According to the Oklahoma, constitutional statutes, it's illegal to fly the first state flag because it's red, right? And while the state flag isn't identified in the statute, it does say very clearly it's a felony punishable with 10 years and up to $10,000. These anti-red flag laws were passed in different parts of the country too, where the labor movement was strong or socialism, had a strong, big part of the demographic. And that was the case in Oklahoma. We had a very strong socialist party. In fact, at one time, we had the biggest state party in the United States. And that would have been within the first decade of our statehood. But in 1919, the political tides turned. We had entered World War I. The draft had been instituted for the first time. And there was a lot of sentiment against entering the war, particularly among socialists, and particularly among socialists in Oklahoma. Because many of the people, the Socialist Party of Oklahoma represented a very diverse group of people, because many tenant farmers lived in Oklahoma. By the time 1919 rolls around, 12 years after we become a state, our agricultural economy had completely turned around. And where people came to Oklahoma to stake claims for land of their own, many of them ended up not being able to make it. And they became tenant farmers as land was bought up by those with the money to do so. And tenant farmers didn't have an easy life. Obviously, they were sharecroppers. They got a percentage of the profit of their crops. Usually that was given to them in some sort of like, there's a word for it, a money that's not national money.
Like a script that's only good.
Thank you. Yes. And so the landowner would give them the script. They would spend the script at the store, and they got to stay in a shack on the property. Right. And so these people were really open to the idea that wealth should be fairly distributed because they lived in a reality where it was not. They were creating the wealth by their labor, but they were not receiving it. And so socialism was very appealing to them, very attractive to them. And they were adamantly against entry into World War I because they knew that if the men left, who would bring in the crops? How would the families survive without the male bodies in the field? And the interesting thing about tenant farmers in Oklahoma is that they, we usually picture them as white, but they were very racially diverse. I mean, particularly we had African American, Native Americans representing multiple tribal groups, and of course the category nobody ever thinks of, but people who had both African American and Native American descendancy.
Were they distributed widely all around the state, or were they concentrated in certain pockets?
There were pockets. Mostly we tend to think of it as like the eastern counties, Seminole County in that area. But it was also occurring in the southwestern part of the state. So down by Greer County, for instance. There were pockets and up northeast. So, yeah, I mean, and we know these things existed because we can go back and we can look at the Socialist Party of Oklahoma platform from 1914, and we could see what they were advocating for. We can look at newspaper accounts of their activities, and at that time, people weren't uncomfortable with socialism. Socialism was not yet associated with political disloyalty. But Bolshevism kind of changed that because, of course, they overthrew the Russian government. And so they became a threat. The left became a threat, a political threat. And the flag went down in the flames. So further investigation of the flag, I mean, once something like that is suppressed for political reasons, finding information about it is difficult for a researcher. But my fascination kind of continued until on and on, reading about these different pockets of this legacy of the left in Oklahoma history. And then they pulled the vault out of the church in Oklahoma City. And in that vault, the Century Vault, Century Chest is what the Oklahoma Historical Society calls it, the Oklahoma History Center, the Century Chest. All kinds of wonderful things there, and that exhibit is great. And one of the things that was in it was a flag made by Ruth Clement. In fact, that's when I learned her name, because she had always been Mrs. W.R. Clement to me. And she had interned a flag, and she had interned a letter about it. And it's interesting because the postcard that she left with the flag kind of indicates it was already becoming unpopular. And she was sort of defending it.
Was that 1913 that it was?
When that chest went in, I think you're right, 1913.
It was already becoming unpopular.
2 years later.
Wow, okay.
Right? And that just kind of shows the political strife. But come to find out, another fascinating turn in the story is that Ruth Clement also interned documents on behalf of the Oklahoma State chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy. And so now the red flag becomes a symbol of a different kind of rebellion. Yes, and I'm still turning it around in my brain.
Right.
How does that shift occur? And how does that play forward into the present with where we are today? And what does that suggest about how the two different Reds, the socialist Reds and the red state Reds, have in common that we're not seeing, we're not hearing, and because of these filters, these lenses?
What could they have in common? Do you think if we think of a Venn diagram, where do they meet? What common ground is there?
I would say a general distrust of the establishment.
Which persists today.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
For different reasons, the reasons why people, who might identify on the left, whether, there's a spectrum there. We need to keep that in mind. We're not talking about the left and the right. I don't want to play into that metaphor because I think it overly simplifies a complex political situation. But people who might identify with the left have different reasons for not trusting the establishment, right? As people on the right. But overall, they have that general dissatisfaction, right? Distrust. And I think there's a way in which we can use that as an entry for dialogue, civil dialogue. If we listen to that closely and actually have compassion for it.
So how was this one of the strongest socialist movements in the country squashed or erased? So did it happen fairly quickly at the end of World War I? Or how did it go away and was erased from our historical memories in a lot of ways?
Well, in my dissertation, that's one of the things I wanted to attempt to solve. And I'm not sure I've solved it, but there was an event that happened in August of 1919. And remember, this is the same year the Red Flag Law was passed, same year of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And there was an event here called the Green Corn Rebellion. And it took place in Seminole County. That's usually where we see historians looking for the beginnings of the rebellion. And I think it took place over the course of 10 days. But there was this idea among a group of people who had joined something called the Working Class Union, which was an arm of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, that believed in one big union, right? That it didn't matter what kind of laborer you were, that labor concerns were similar enough across industries, and that enough strength could be built by joining together that those differences shouldn't separate the workers. And the Working Class Union took a stand against the war and the draft, the Conscription Act, to be specific. And they organized an armed rebellion in rural Oklahoma. And these tenant farmers, African American, Native American, and European American tenant farmers, joined together to stop a war. It's, kind of let that sink in, because that happened in rural Oklahoma.
So they found enough common ground to work together for this larger goal. To
speak to power. And it's interesting because, of course, what they anticipated was they did things like, blow up cattle vats and burn railroad trestles. They were looking to stop the, capitalist structure, because they connected capitalism with World War I. It's a rich man's war, a poor man's fight, right? And so they were trying to stop the mechanisms of capitalism. So it was not just an anti-war rebellion, it's an anti-capitalist rebellion. And so what happened is they were anticipating kind of encountering the National Guard along the way, but once word got out that this was happening among the local farmers and residents around Seminole County, specifically the town of Sasakwa, a group of men, came together, kind of a local militia, to stop the rebellion in its tracks. And so the rebels were encountering their neighbors. And they were able to shut down the rebellion fairly quickly. And I think in the end, 150 people were arrested, and 10 of them spent a decade in Leavenworth federal prison, including the ringleader, the man who was accused of being the ringleader. His name was Munson. They called him Rube Munson, but his name was Henry. Mm-hmm. So that's how you shut down a movement. You humiliate them, right? Now, granted, I wouldn't recommend taking up arms against a government that has much bigger guns than you. But mainly because that kind of suppression is inevitable. And what that does to the larger movement around justice or economic equality matters. And so I think that's what we can learn today from an incident like the Green Corn Rebellion. Number one, the positives, that people can work together across difference in Oklahoma. And that people can see the mechanisms of injustice in their own lives. I think that we can learn that. That's a positive takeaway. But, we also have negative takeaways that, you want to be careful how you choose to speak your truth, which is not to say be silent at all, right? But move with integrity. And sometimes we know that still doesn't work. But integrity with your own values, the human values that you'd like to see others uphold, people in power uphold.
What should we remember, or what should we have been taught about Indian resistance movements in Oklahoma?
Well, that's an interesting segue from the Green Corn Rebellion, because the Green Corn Rebellion got its name from the ceremonial calendar of the tribes that were removed to Oklahoma or Indian Territory from the southeastern part of the United States. So the Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, Muskogee Creek, and Chickasaw tribes use a ceremonial calendar that celebrated the lunar cycles. And the green corn, I should say, they celebrate a ceremonial calendar, practice a ceremonial calendar that includes the celebration of green corn. And green corn is when the new corn comes on, the new crop of the new year comes on, and it's seen as a time of renewal, which is a really interesting sort of way to connect, native epistemologies with anti-war rebellion, right? It's a time of renewal in the ceremonial calendar. So that's where the Green Corn Rebellion got its name, which suggests that native resistance has always been present here. And I can say it still is, just from my work with communities today and from my research and talking with people who are still what I would call cultural activists in these communities. But yes, there was a lot of resistance toward the ideas of allotment, the ideas of statehood. Native peoples in the state, the tribal representatives that dealt with the commissions, the Dawes Commission and the Jerome Commission, who came to negotiate, air quotes, these treaties with the tribes. Many of the tribes never agreed, and those that agreed clearly agreed under coercion, which is not consent, as we are learning. Right? And so I think that it's important for people to remember that because tribal cultures continue in our state, and tribal knowledges and languages have been sustained despite that kind of intentional eradication policy, is resistance. The fact that I can sit here and say that I'm Cherokee, in my mind, is in a way resistance. Because 100 years ago, the policy was assimilation for Native Americans. And that meant that you spared the man and you killed the Indian, right? And so that I can still sit here and claim that as my identity, to me, is a testament. So that resistance continues in small ways and big ways, I think, in Oklahoma.
So when you've taught a class about alternative Oklahoma history. What stories do you think have resonated the most with your students or surprised them the most?
Well, number one, my students cannot believe that Indians had slaves.
Ah.
That's new to them.
Huh.
Right? And that the first, people of African descent that came into Indian territory came with the native tribes that were removed from the South. And they were usually the slaves of the wealthy sort of mixed blood landowners who had adopted, not wholesale, but had adopted, for the most part, the Southern plantation culture. Not all of those tribal members owned slaves, but some did. And they came on them remover trail too. They suffered, probably more so in some cases, along those removal trails. So that surprises my students. They're like, what? Right? Our students like to think about discrete racial categories. You're white, you're black, you're Native American. But sometimes you're all of it. Right? And so what does that help us understand, right, about humanity and people and culture and history? I've had many students who occupy each of those, identities. And, maybe one of them has been suppressed from their family narrative. But talking about that in class allows them to kind of reclaim it. I have a lot of students that are mixed blood, white and Native American, who really struggle. And I encourage them. I say, you've inherited this amazing history. People walked here, so you could be here. And to me, as a person who identifies as a Cherokee woman, I have a sacred duty to that history, and to tell those stories. So I always encourage my students to do the same. So that surprises them. What else surprises them? They're always surprised by the way that power responds to people asking for fair treatment. So when we read about organized labor in Oklahoma, or when we read about the Green Corn Rebellion, they're always surprised by how folks who participate in those things are punished, because it's cruel. There were men that were tarred and feathered outside of Tulsa, something called the Tulsa outrage, I believe, that's in, we cover in class. An article by Nigel Sellers in one of Davis Joyce's books talks about it.
What time period was that? This
would have been the 19-teens, early 1920s, just right around the time of the Tulsa race riot. So again, what do we see that we have in common? If the powers that be in Tulsa at that time were suppressing organized labor with violence, and the city was in on it, because the police department participated, according to Sellers' article. These are the same powers that conceived of and, perpetrated the destruction of Greenwood in Tulsa. I don't want to call it a race riot because that's not what it was. It was an attack. So, at any rate, what do these two groups have in common? They have in common a desire to amend the power structure, that keeps them from economic development, that keeps them from, a good life, despite their hard work.
Another story from Oklahoma history that you've spoken about eloquently is sort of a story of censorship. You told me a story once about a socialist bookstore that existed in Oklahoma City, and
it's a communist bookstore.
A communist bookstore.
Now we're in the 1940s, so we're into communism.
Just to jump ahead. So what's the story of the communist bookstore of Oklahoma City?
It's another.
And why can't I go shopping there today?
Yes, it's another very beautiful story in Oklahoma that has positive and negative takeaways, of course, but that's how stories go. It was a bookstore that was actually owned and operated by the Communist Party of the United States. It was run by a guy named Bob Wood and his wife, Ina. And they came to Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl, that Bob Wood did in the 1930s, because Oklahoma at that time was receiving a lot of attention nationally because of the Dust Bowl and the devastation that economic and environmental disaster kind of incurred here. Made us, for better or for worse, kind of poster children for the Great Depression. And so we were in the media, all across the nation and across the world. And so young people, young communists who wanted to see a resolution to the country's economic problems that included a fair distribution of wealth, came to Oklahoma because they were curious. They wanted to see, they wanted to help. And so they came to Oklahoma and organized a Communist Party arm here. And that included a bookstore in Oklahoma City. And the bookstore sold all kinds of books, political ideologies, Marxism, Stalinism, Lenin, books such as this. And people in the area, would come to the bookstore. And I had the privilege of meeting a woman several years ago named Wilma Jaffe at a presentation about a book on this topic. And the book I would recommend is from OU Press. It's called Books on Trial, Red Scare in the Heartland. And Wilma Jaffe was there at the Communist Bookstore in Oklahoma City the day that the Oklahoma City Police Department raided it.
What year was that?
That would have been 1941.
Okay.
And she was a minor. She was 16, but her 18-year-old brother and her parents, along with about 7 other people, were arrested just by virtue of being in the bookstore. So once again, we have to think about contextualizing this in national history, right? At that time, we're starting to see the slow rise of McCarthyism. And there was a senator from Texas named Dyes who came up into Oklahoma and started something that's referred to in the book as the Little Dyes Committee. And this was kind of the prototype for the House on Un-American Activities that came out of McCarthyism, where they were persecuting communists and blacklisting people, who were involved in any sort of thing that they could even remotely call communist, right? And they got their practice round in Oklahoma City. And the Oklahoma City Police Department came in, arrested these people, seized a bunch of books as evidence. Books as evidence. I'm going to arrest you because of the books you're reading. I just want to make it clear. That's what we're saying here. So, yes, and they were held in, 4 of them ended up going to trial. 4 of these communist book readers ended up going to trial. And, of course, they were being, interrogated on stand around their loyalty to the United States government and so on and so forth. And these books were being used. They would literally read lines out of the book as evidence. Books that were in the bookstore. Well, the wonderful thing that came out of this is that it really solidified people who could see clearly this was a violation of the First Amendment. And, those in Oklahoma, political leaders in Oklahoma, church leaders in Oklahoma, again, representing both races. When I say both, I mean white and black. I'm not sure of any Native American voices that were present in this, although I know they were there. But the public clearly saw it as sort of silly, as kind of ridiculous display. But there was a book burning in Taft Stadium down on May Avenue around this, and that was our high school stadium. John Marshall played football games there, and when I was little, I used to ride around at like homecoming games when my brothers were in school at John Marshall and Wave. And I'm thinking, they burn books in Taft Stadium?
The ashes of them are being ground under the wheels of your homecoming parade.
That's crazy. But that's the layers of history, right? So it just like totally revises my sense of Oklahoma history and the city I grew up in. But at any rate, this movement kind of formed around these people who just kept calling out the constitutional violations in the newspaper, editorial letters, local magazines, protests on the street, and then also nationally, into public intellectuals from all over the United States were writing to, Oklahoma politicians, basically asking them to call off the trials. Now, the court that ruled, that ended up convicting, I think, the 4 people, and that decision was overturned by the Oklahoma State Court. So the Oklahoma Supreme Court overturned the lower court's decision. So fortunately, justice prevailed in Oklahoma on that one in the end, but not until after a lot of spectacle. And a lot
incarceration.
And incarceration, suffering on the part of true suffering on the part of people who just continued to speak on behalf of our freedom in this country to think politically as we choose and to read what we want and to organize as we wish, right? So it's a beautiful story in that way, because I think there was something, going through the process of learning all these things, there's something in it that calls to me. If my original question was, how did I come from here and have the political opinions that I have, never having identified as a socialist or a communist, but still believing in certain things, do we inherit it? Do we inherit it in a way? Are we part of a legacy that, even though we're not aware of, is there? Because those folks impacted discourse, public discourse and public dialogue and public decisions, court decisions in this case. So you want to believe in the impact, the ongoing impact of their effort and their work. And of course, then we pick up the ball from them.
I wanted to ask about your research. You examine local activist rhetorical strategies. What does that mean? What sorts of things do you research?
Well, basically, because I'm interested in how people sustain cultural knowledge and cultural identity in the midst of suppression, in particular thinking about Native American tribes, tribal groups that I looked at in my dissertation were, of course, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. I looked at a movement in history called the Redbird Smith movement. And then I brought that forward to the present by interviewing people that I call cultural activists, because they work in the community to sustain the language, to sustain the stories, to sustain the ceremonial practices, and so forth. So the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the Cherokee community, and then, of course, the Kiowa, who I've worked with for a long time, looking at their history around allotment and the ways that their headmen resisted the Jerome Commission in their negotiations. The Kiowa never came to an uncontested agreement with the United States federal government regarding their allotment. And in fact, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, at which time the Supreme Court said, no, we can break treaties. It was that decision, Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock, gave Congress the power to break treaties.
What year was that?
Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock was, I want to say, like 1901. Yeah, 1901, 1902. And yes, so I see that as resistance. And then again, interviewing cultural activists today who continue to work for sustaining that historical knowledge and cultural knowledge and the language and the stories and the songs and the practices. Because it is, in my mind, it is resistance. Now, what I've noticed, you asked me, what kind of rhetorics do they use? The first question to ask is, do you see yourself as an activist, right? Because I'm imposing that, that term on them. And more often than not, the people that I interviewed would say, no, and I think that might be part of the impact of suppression. And maybe it still doesn't feel safe, or we've inherited this notion that it's not safe to say I'm an activist in Oklahoma, particularly if you represent a marginalized community in Oklahoma. But most of them just see that they are working for what they believe is important and good, right? Which is exactly what any activist would say as well. So, but there's some avoidance of the term activist. So that's a rhetorical choice to me in my field. And, if you can still get the work done, and if it helps you get the work done, then don't use it, right? There's no reason for it. In fact, it's a strategy. It's a very smart strategy for accomplishing what needs to be accomplished. I asked one of the women that I interviewed, she's Kiowa, she's a wonderful person. I don't know if I have permission to use her name, so I won't name her. But I asked her, do you consider yourself an activist? She says, no, I'm just being Kiowa. Right? I'm just doing what Kiowas do. I'm practicing my culture. Right? So, yes, those kind of rhetorical strategies. Another one would be storytelling. I think that's something that the academy, the Western Academy, doesn't appreciate. And certainly has never legitimized this idea that stories are valuable, maybe because they're too personal or they're too subjective. They're not evidence-based, they're anecdotal or something such as this. But for many communities, storytelling is a primary rhetorical practice, a primary tool, right? And it's used for rhetorical purposes to teach, to persuade, to heal, to advocate. And so to me, one way of thinking about, how as a Cherokee woman I can speak to the academy is by speaking about stories and listening deeply to stories, and relaying stories when it's appropriate to do so, and thinking about how they are valuable. And it's interesting because I hear so much dialogue going on right now around story. Just everywhere you look, there's StoryCorps. There's a wonderful conference coming up at OSU, the Wesley Foundation, called My Story Matters, for women to kind of explore their own stories and see what is emerging from them in terms of their own vision and purpose for their lives. Story is something that I think people need right now because we're searching for meaning. We're searching for meaning, I think, in our world today. And stories allow us to make our own meaning. That's what's beautiful about them. It's not somebody coming and telling you what to think. It's somebody asking you to listen and think what you will. Add to it. Take what's meaningful to you, and fold it into your own story. See how it applies. So that's why I think we're hearing so much about it these days, or I am. But I pay attention. I listen for it. So maybe it's just me.
Well, speaking of stories, Oklahoma Humanities gave a small grant to a project that you were involved with that I'd love to talk about, the KiowaTalk.org website, which I think is an awesome example of cultural activism. Can you kind of describe this project?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking, and thank you for funding it.
We are so proud to be a part of it, and we will put a link to it on the website for this episode, too, so people can check it out, among links to other stuff that we've talked about today. But yes, please talk about the KiowaTalk.org website.
Well, I work with wonderful elders in the Kiowa community, and elders have a real sense of time and urgency around sharing their knowledge, because our time as humans is limited as far as we know. And anyway, I guess over the years we started thinking about, well, how can we forward the knowledge of our elders of this generation into the future? And of course, digital archives provide a wonderful way of doing that. And so over the course of the last 2 years, we've been working on kind of a prototype for an ongoing project. KiowaTalk.org, it's up, it's running, it's available to the public. And essentially it's videos of one of the elders that we work with in the Kiowa community, sharing what she knows, language, words, songs, stories, sentences, anything that comes to her mind, she kind of writes down, and then we video her speaking it, and then we transcribe the language in both English and Kiowa on the screen, so that what I like to imagine is 100 years from now, someone who can jump on and hear this elder speak the language and sing the songs. And I think it's an educational tool because, you can play the videos over and over again. They last from like 30 seconds to 7 minutes, depending on what it's a video of, a song, a story, a word, different links. But you can see her pronunciating the word. Because some of the sounds in Kiowa are not in English, so they're new for most mouths. And you can read it on the screen because a lot of people are visual learners. So you've got a textual system on the screen representing the sounds. And it makes them accessible as well. And so, yeah, it's basically a collection. And we've got about 270 videos up there now. We want to add to them. We want to include more elders in the project. And I think that we are going to be working to do that over the next couple years, encouraging everybody who has an elder that they would like to get involved to consider joining the project. And I would like to see it kind of as a model for something that's replicable in other locations, with other groups. And of course, they don't just have to be Native American groups. All communities have these elders with this knowledge and these histories and stories. And we need to cherish them, I think, because they're a part. We wouldn't be here without them, basically.
It is an amazing project. It's so beautifully done. I have to warn listeners to have a box of Kleenex by their side because when one of our Oklahoma Humanities staff members first saw it, she started crying hearing some of the songs and stories. They're really beautiful.
Well, what comes across is the elder's passion.
Yeah.
For her culture, and that's kind of a visceral experience when you're welcomed into a space to share that passion. So that's awesome.
Well, I have one last question for you. You mentioned that our time as humans is limited, and unfortunately our time on the podcast is limited too. I wish we could stay and talk for a few more hours, but I'm curious on the subject of alternative Oklahoma history. Is there maybe a counterfactual that you would propose, like a what if moment? What if something had gone differently, a different decision had been made in Oklahoma history that would have set us on a different path than where we are now? Does anything come to mind? What's a what if that you ponder about Oklahoma history?
Well, I like to think, what if Oklahoma had become the state of Sequoia? Or what if it had become an all-black state? Of course, there was also a movement for that. Or what if everybody could have heard each other, in the process of negotiating what statehood would look like? And so that maybe allotment wouldn't have happened, or maybe a Native American epistemology would have been the reference point for the way the government here was structured. What if we had been more inclusive at that time? Because we have such a rich collection of voices here, which means we have a lot of potential. And if things had gone differently, had we been able to listen more closely to each other and each other's stories, what would Oklahoma look like today, I think, would be the question I would want to ask. Good news is we can always do that now.
It's not too late.
Right.
But thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. And we encourage listeners to comment about what you've heard on the BrainBox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/BrainBox website, and on social media by using #BrainBoxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios, where we record. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon. This program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. And this has been BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin.